the potential for early use of nuclear weapons is very strong. A lot of people believe that North Korea wouldn't use a nuclear weapon until ROC and U.S. forces might be pushing into North Korean territory and even approaching Pyongyang. But if Kim Jong-un is desperate, he may well try to use every capability he's got early on.
We'll get to that interview in just a moment. From Asia News Weekly, this is Asia Now, the podcast featuring stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. In 2013, Kim Jong-un rattled his saber and the world went crazy. But what's really happening in North Korea? That's one conversation taking place in Asia now. Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Asia Now podcast. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you for listening and joining me this week on the podcast. If we turn our gaze to East Asia, one of the biggest question marks out there is the misnamed Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or simply North Korea. When you look at it from space, you can't see anything. What exactly does Pyongyang have in store for us this year? Well, that happens to be a very good question. And to get some of those answers, I phoned up and I would like to welcome Dr. Bruce Bennett, Senior Defense Analyst with the RAND Corporation, to this week's podcast. Dr. Bennett, welcome to Asia Now.
Thank you. I enjoy the opportunity.
So let's take a look at North Korea. Right now, there's the joint U.S.-South Korean military drills taking place. Can you briefly describe what their purpose is?
Sure. North Korea continues to pose a serious military threat to South Korea and the United States. It continues to claim that it wants to invade the South. It's declared 2015 as the year for a militarily imposed unification. And so South Korea and the United States exercise together. You need to exercise to make sure that your militaries are doing the right things together, and that's the ultimate objective of the drills.
Now, the DPRK always says these drills are a prelude to war. And as you mentioned, the two countries are still technically at war. But North Korea always says that these drills unnecessarily escalate tensions on the peninsula. Now, is that response just for show, or are there any truly visible signs of tensions being escalated aside from the random rocket launch or two?
Well, we have to remember that North Korea doesn't make its statements just for positioning purposes. North Korea is trying to convince the United States and South Korea to stop the exercises. They're putting out extreme pressure. The problem for North Korea is if they really plan an aggressive war against the North and the South, at the current point in time, they're not likely to win. They don't have the capabilities, and the U.S. and South Korea are well prepared. If they can get the United States and South Korea to stop preparing together and degrade their combined military capabilities, then they get into the kind of position they want. So this is a lot like Adolf Hitler bargaining over the Sudetenland in the late 1930s, taking a part of the Czechoslovakia at the time and saying, boy, now you're going to have peace in our time. And it didn't exactly happen that way. This was just one other way for German expansion. So it's kind of similar with North Korea. They're primarily trying to edge. Are there tensions? Absolutely. The North is always angry about things like the Sony picture done on the interview, about other statements made, such as President Obama's statement that the North will eventually collapse. So these are all problems for the North. They think they are our offenses, and they're trying to push back. We do have to remember, though, that during this entire time when they have been complaining about the South and U.S. exercises, they've been doing their own winter training exercises, which, because they talk about it being an offensive kind of war they would like to pursue, their own exercises are offensive in character. So they're a bit of a hypocrite.
That is certainly true. If we turn our attention to Kim Jong-un, he's going to Moscow in May. I was wondering what you think this says about his relationship with other world leaders in the region, and specifically, how do we now perceive North Korea's relationship with China? Is there a shift taking place?
Well, there's certainly been a shift between North Korea and Chinese relationships. China has been very upset during the last years of Kim Jong-il's reign and now during Kim Jong-un's reign that when China tries to influence North Korea, telling them, for example, not to do a nuclear test, North Korea basically ignores the Chinese statements. And for China, which is trying to be a great power, to be mistreated by a small and not very powerful country like North Korea, that's an extreme offense to the Chinese, makes them very angry. So there are debates going on in China about, okay, so what do we do with this upstart that doesn't respect us and doesn't really like us and we really don't like them? In contrast, for example, to the U.S.-South Korean relationship, China and North Korea never do exercises, military exercises together. They don't plan military operations together. So it's not the same kind of an alliance that we usually think about. So, in that sense, that relationship is downgraded. Now, North Korea was absolutely great at trying to push China and Russia to compete with each other during the Cold War. But once the end of the Cold War came, and the Soviet Union fell apart, Russia was no longer competing against China, and that undermined one of the North's greatest way of getting handouts, which the North has had to survive on because of its poor economy. So now that China is not quite as cooperative as the North would like, its being able to leverage Russia will potentially give it an opportunity both to get Russian assistance, but also to pit the two against each other. So I think this is more a kind of competition. Now, there's been a lot of talk of Kim Jong-un going to Russia in May. We'll see if that's what happens. It could well be what happens, or he could send a representative. At this stage, something for us yet to observe and see what develops.
You mentioned a few moments ago about the nuclear test, and there's a lot of speculation on when that fourth test will be. Some say it may happen at the end of these joint military drills. Others are placing it in October. Are there really any definitive signs that truly indicate how close the DPRK is to carrying out this test, or is it really just a guessing game?
Well, we've been told several times by senior leadership in South Korea as they've testified to their National Assembly that the North has actually fundamentally prepared to do the test. They've got the weapons underground. They've got them ready to detonate. It's not so much a capability issue as it is a political issue. When can they get away with doing this? And part of the problem they face, again, is with China. During the third nuclear test, which was a fair amount bigger than the second test, the ground shook and there were concerns in China because of how close the nuclear test site is to China. The Chinese people were pretty upset about what had happened in Manchuria, and they were really worried that the North Koreans may have gotten the design of the test site wrong and would have vented radiation that could potentially blow into China. So the local Chinese people made a big uproar with Beijing and raised some real concerns about North Korea being so irresponsible. If North Korea does a fourth test, they're likely going to be going for a bigger yield. They're going to cause more distress to the people in Manchuria. That's going to really bother the Chinese. So North Korea's got to choose a time. When is it worth their while to basically cause distress to the U.S. and South Korea and live with the distress they've caused to China? So far, they've decided that it wasn't that time yet. And so this political trade-off, you watch it and you say, what could cause that? And there are various things that could. China could cut back on the aid being provided to North Korea. China could increasingly move in the direction of saying that they don't want to support North Korea. And those would be times where the North could well choose politically to then trigger a detonation and tell China, look, you got to take us seriously. You've got to give us more respect.
Likewise, there's a lot of discussion taking place about the North's ability to miniaturize nuclear weapons. But of course, it also has a fairly capable cyber warfare unit. In your opinion, which poses the greater threat?
Well, North Korea has been able to carry out cyber warfare during peacetime. They've done a multitude of attacks against South Korea, both smaller and then larger attacks, especially in 2013. That is a vehicle which they would use in a true wartime circumstance, but which they're able to use now to demonstrate their empowerment, their capabilities, and cause distress in South Korea, attack their enemies in the South and in the United States. So that's a vehicle which has advantages even now. Of course, nuclear weapons, if they use them now, that would create the major war. That would cause the big conflict to occur. So they are likely to withhold them until a big conflict. They think that they're at the stage of that. We don't expect Kim Jong-un to simply wake up someday and say, you know, it's a great day to go south. Let's go defeat the South. Because his military capability is getting older in many ways and not as capable. Though that's not as true with his weapons of mass destruction. Some of them are much more up-to-date capabilities. We instead think he will probably someday wake up and say, you know, I'm afraid that the North Korean military is about to rebel against me. I probably need to keep them busy by ordering them south and hope that at some point we can get to a new armistice somewhere in the South where I can keep control of North Korea, claim a great victory, and keep the North Korean people convinced that the Americans and the South Koreans are their eternal enemies, but also satisfy the North Korean army that they got something good out of the situation. That's called a diversionary war in the academic literature. And, if that's what the North does, the potential for early use of nuclear weapons is very strong. A lot of people believe that North Korea wouldn't use a nuclear weapon until ROC and U.S. forces might be pushing into North Korean territory and even approaching Pyongyang. But if Kim Jong-un is desperate, he may well try to use every capability he's got early on to create a condition where he can get an armistice and change the nature of the relations on the peninsula. So in a big war, probably nuclear weapons are the big capability. In a smaller situation, in peacetime situation, cyber warfare's got the advantage. But cyber warfare could possibly have an advantage even in a wartime if they could shut down the power grids in South Korea, if they could cause major disruptions to the military. It's just hard to tell exactly how capable they might be.
Okay, if we take a look at the United Nations, last year there, of course, was the Commission of Inquiry report on human rights abuses in North Korea. Is that report actually going to have any kind of effect? Will it drive North Korea to really address its own human rights issues?
Well, I think the answer is that until the Kim regime is no longer in power, we're not going to see a fundamental change there. But the Kim regime simultaneously doesn't like to be criticized internationally. They want to tell their people that they're a great power, indeed a regional great power, that is a peer of China and the United States, a part of their propaganda. And so they don't like it being said internationally that they have a terrible human rights record. They claim quite the contrary. They don't want that kind of embarrassment. So it's important to make sure that there is a record made of actions they've taken. Sooner or later, the regime is probably going to go away, and when that happens, there are going to have to be decisions made on what you do about the various leaders and who you hold responsible for these things. So having things like the Commission of Inquiry, I think, is a very valuable effort.
You mentioned the Kim regime. I've mentioned the Kim regime. We've talked about people who are actually in charge of North Korea. And every once in a while, there are rumors that surface that say that Kim Jong-un truly isn't the one leading North Korea. There's some puppet masters behind the curtains. What do you think about those kinds of rumors?
Well, it's really hard to tell. We don't know. We don't even know how much rice and other grains North Korea produced last year, let alone something like what the palace relationships are. There may be snippets we get in terms of appearances, but the thing which strikes me is the degree to which there is a certain impetuousness and a certain aggressiveness among the North Korean leadership that I don't think I saw in a comparable manner during the Kim Jong-il leadership period. Is he totally in charge, or is he sharing some of the leadership role, or is he a puppet? I don't know. I think he probably is at least partially in charge, and maybe in a major way. The regime is making decisions such as the theme parks and the ski runs and so forth, which have a flavor of youthful interest that a more mature leader might not push so hard on. But we don't know. We just don't know who's in charge. And so in many ways we're guessing. Maybe someday we'll find out, but I don't think we know now.
All right. Dr. Bruce Bennett is a senior defense analyst with the RAND Corporation. Thank you so much for joining me this week.
Happy to do so.
Before I go, I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on what you think we'll see from that young dictator in North Korea this year. Please leave a comment or share your thoughts via Facebook or Twitter. To stay informed with more news from the region, please follow Asia News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. If you have any questions, comments, or even feedback about the show, please send me an email message. Our address is podcast@asianewsweekly.net. If you enjoyed today's program, please share it with your friends, and while you're at it, subscribe. You can do so at our website, asianewsweekly.net, or in your favorite podcast application. Subscribing is absolutely free, and when you do, that next episode is delivered automatically to you. Well, my friends, it is time for me to go, but thank you so much for joining me. My name is Steve Miller, reminding you to be true to yourself and always be awesome.